Chapter 30. Grop. The story of Fred and George's flight to freedom was retold so often over the next few days that Harry could tell it would soon become the stuff of Hogwarts legend. Within a week, even those who had been eyewitnesses were half convinced that they had seen the twins dive-bomb Umbridge on their brooms, pelting her with dung bombs before zooming out of the doors. In the immediate aftermath of their departure, there was a great wave of talk about copying them, so that Harry frequently heard students saying things like, "Honestly, some days, I just feel like jumping on my broom and leaving this place." Or else, "One more lesson like that, and I might just do a Weasley." Fred and George had made sure that nobody was likely to forget them very soon. For one thing, they had not left instructions on how to remove the swamp that now filled the corridor on the 5th floor of the East Wing. Umbridge and Filch had been observed trying different means of removing it, but without success. Eventually, the area was roped off, and Filch, gnashing his teeth furiously, was given the task of punting students across it to their classrooms. Harry was certain that teachers like McGonagall or Flitwick could have removed the swamp in an instant, but just as in the case of Fred and George's wildfire whiz-bangs, they seemed to prefer to watch Umbridge struggle. Then there were the 2 large broom-shaped holes in Umbridge's office door, through which Fred and George's clean sweeps had smashed to rejoin their masters. Filch fitted a new door and removed Harry's firebolt to the dungeons where, it was rumored, Umbridge had set an armed security troll to guard it. However, her troubles were far from over. Inspired by Fred and George's example, a great number of students were now vying for the newly vacant positions of troublemakers-in-chief. In spite of the new door, somebody managed to slip a hairy-snouted niffler into Umbridge's office, which promptly tore the place apart in its search for shiny objects, leapt on Umbridge on her re-entrance, and tried gnawing off her rings from her stubby fingers. Dung bombs and stink pellets were dropped so frequently in the corridors that it became the new fashion for students to perform bubblehead charms on themselves before leaving lessons, which ensured them a supply of fresh, clean air, even though it gave them all the peculiar appearance of wearing upside-down goldfish bowls on their heads. Filch prowled the corridors with a horsewhip ready in his hands, desperate to catch miscreants, but the problem was that there were now so many of them that he did not know which way to turn. The Inquisitorial Squad were attempting to help him, but odd things kept happening to its members. Warrington of the Slytherin Quidditch team reported to the hospital room with a horrible skin complaint that made him look as though he had been coated in cornflakes. Pansy Parkinson, to Hermione's delight, missed all her lessons the following day, as she had sprouted antlers. Meanwhile, it became clear just how many skiving snack boxes Fred and George had managed to sell before leaving Hogwarts. Umbridge only had to enter her classroom for the students assembled there to faint, vomit, develop dangerous fevers, or else spout blood from both nostrils. Shrieking with rage and frustration, she attempted to trace the mysterious symptoms to their source, but the students told her stubbornly they were suffering Umbridge-itis. After putting 4 successive classes in detention and failing to discover their secret, she was forced to give up and allow the bleeding, swooning, sweating, and vomiting students to leave her classes in droves. But not even the users of the snack boxes could compete with that master of chaos, Peeves, who seemed to have taken Fred's parting words deeply to heart. Cackling madly, he soared through the school, upending tables, bursting out of blackboards, and toppling statues and vases. Twice he shut Mrs. Norris inside suits of armor, from which she was rescued, yowling loudly by the furious caretaker. He smashed lanterns and snuffed out candles, juggled burning torches over the heads of screaming students, caused neatly stacked piles of parchment to topple into fires or out of windows, flooded the 2nd floor when he pulled off all the taps in the bathrooms, dropped a bag of tarantulas in the middle of the Great Hall during breakfast, and, whenever he fancied a break, spent hours at a time floating along after Umbridge and blowing loud raspberries every time she spoke. None of the staff but Filch seemed to be stirring themselves to help her. Indeed, a week after Fred and George's departure, Harry witnessed Professor McGonagall walking right past Peeves, who was determinedly loosening a crystal chandelier, and could have sworn he heard her tell the poltergeist out of the corner of her mouth, "It unscrews the other way." To cap matters, Montague had still not recovered from his sojourn in the toilet. He remained confused and disoriented, and his parents were to be observed one Tuesday morning striding up the front drive, looking extremely angry. "Should we say something?" said Hermione in a worried voice, pressing her cheek against the Charms window so that she could see Mr. and Mrs. Montague marching inside. "About what happened to him? In case it helps Madame Pomfrey cure him?" "Of course not. He'll recover," said Ron indifferently. "Anyway, more trouble for Umbridge, isn't it?" said Harry in a satisfied voice. He and Ron both tapped the teacups they were supposed to be charming with their wands. Harry's spouted 4 very short legs that would not reach the desk and wriggled pointlessly in midair. Ron's grew 4 very thin, spindly legs that hoisted the cup off the desk with great difficulty, trembled for a few seconds, then folded, causing the cup to crack in two. "Reparo," said Hermione quickly, mending Ron's cup with a wave of her wand. "That's all very well, but what if Montague's permanently injured?" "Who cares?" said Ron irritably, while his teacup stood drunkenly again, trembling violently at the knees. "Montague shouldn't have tried taking all those points from Gryffindor, should he? If you want to worry about anyone, Hermione, worry about me." "You?" she said, catching her teacup as it scampered happily away across the desk on 4 sturdy little willow-patterned legs, and replacing it in front of her. "Why should I be worried about you?" When Mum's next letter finally gets through Umbridge's screening process," said Ron bitterly, now holding his cup up while its frail legs tried feebly to support its weight, "I'm going to be in deep trouble. I wouldn't be surprised if she sent to Howler again." "But it'll be my fault Fred and George left. You wait," said Ron darkly. "She'll say I should have stopped them leaving. I should have grabbed the ends of their brooms and hung on or something. Yeah, it'll be all my fault." "Well, if she does say all that, it'll be very unfair. You couldn't have done anything. But I'm sure she won't. I mean, if it's really true they've got premises in Diagon Alley now, they must have been planning this for ages." "Yeah, but that's another thing. How did they get the premises?" said Ron, hitting his teacup so hard with his wand that its legs collapsed again and it lay twitching before him. "It's a bit dodgy, isn't it? They'll need loads of galleons to afford rent on a place in Diagon Alley. She'll want to know what they've been up to get their hands on all that sort of gold." "Well, yes, that occurred to me too," said Hermione, allowing her teacup to jog in neat little circles around Harry's, whose stubby little legs were still unable to touch the desktop. "I've been wondering whether Mundungus has persuaded them to sell stolen goods or something awful." "He hasn't," said Harry curtly. "But how do you know?" said Ron and Hermione together. "Because—" Harry hesitated, but the moment to confess finally seemed to have come. There was no good to be gained in keeping silent if it meant anyone suspected that Fred and George were criminals. "Because they got the gold from me. I gave them my Triwizard winnings last June." There was a shocked silence. Then Hermione's teacup jogged right over the edge of the desk and smashed on the floor. "Oh, Harry, you didn't!" she said. "Yes, I did," said Harry mutinously. "And I don't regret it either. I didn't need the gold, and they'll be great at a joke shop." But this is excellent," said Ron, looking thrilled. "It's all your fault. Harry, Mum can't blame me at all. Can I tell her?" "Yeah, I suppose you'd better," said Harry dully. "Specifically if she thinks they're receiving stolen cauldrons or something." Hermione said nothing at all for the rest of the lesson, but Harry had a shrewd suspicion that her self-restraint was bound to crack before long. Sure enough, once they had left the castle for break and were standing around in the weak May sunshine, she fixed Harry with a beady eye and opened her mouth with a determined air. Harry interrupted her before she had even started. "It's no good nagging me, it's done," he said firmly. "Fred and George have got the gold. Spent a good bit of it too, by the sounds of it. And I can't get it back from them, and I don't want to. So save your breath, Hermione." "I wasn't going to say anything about Fred and George," she said in an injured voice. Ron snorted disbelievingly, and Hermione threw him a very dirty look. "No, I wasn't," she said angrily. "As a matter of fact, I was going to ask Harry when he's going to go back to Snape and ask for occlumency lessons again." Harry's heart sank. Once they had exhausted the subject of Fred and George's dramatic departure, which admittedly had taken many hours, Ron and Hermione had wanted to hear news of Sirius. As Harry had not confided in them the reason he had wanted to talk to Sirius in the first place, it had been hard to think of things to tell them. He had ended up saying to them truthfully that Sirius wanted Harry to resume occlumency lessons. He had been regretting this ever since. Hermione would not let the subject drop and kept reverting to it when Harry least expected it. "You can't tell me you've stopped having funny dreams," Hermione said now, "because Ron told me last night you were muttering in your sleep again." Harry threw Ron a furious look. Ron had the grace to look ashamed of himself. You were only muttering a bit," he mumbled apologetically. "Something about just a bit farther." "I dreamed I was watching you lot play Quidditch," Harry lied brutally. "I was trying to get you to stretch it a bit farther to grab the quaffle." Ron's ears went red. Harry felt a kind of vindictive pleasure. He had not, of course, dreamed anything of the sort. Last night he had once again made the journey along the Department of Mysteries corridor. He had passed through the circular room, then the room full of the clicking and dancing light, until he found himself again inside that cavernous room full of shelves on which were ranged dusty glass spheres. He had hurried straight toward row number 97, turned left, and rang along it. It had probably been then that he had spoken aloud, just a bit farther, for he could feel his conscious self struggling to wake, and before he reached the end of the row, he had found himself lying in bed again, gazing up at the canopy of his four-poster. "You are trying to block your mind, aren't you?" said Hermione, looking beadily at Harry. "You are keeping going with your occlumency?" "Of course I am," said Harry, trying to sound as though this question was insulting, but not quite meeting her eye. The truth was that he was so intensely curious about what was hidden in that room full of dusty orbs that he was quite keen for the dreams to continue. The problem was that with just under a month to go until the exams and every free moment devoted to studying, his mind seemed saturated with information when he went to bed, so that he found it very difficult to get to sleep at all. When he did, his overwrought brain presented him most nights with stupid dreams about exams. He also suspected that part of his mind, the part that often spoke in Hermione's voice, now felt guilty on the occasions it strayed down that corridor ending in the black door, and sought to wake him before he could reach Journey's End. "You know," said Ron, whose ears were still flaming red, "if Montague doesn't recover before the Slytherin play Hufflepuff, we might be with a chance of winning the cup." "Yeah, I suppose so," said Harry, glad of a change of subject. "I mean, we've won one, lost one. If Slytherin lose to Hufflepuff next Saturday—" "Yeah, that's right," said Harry, losing track of what he was agreeing to. Cho Chang had just walked across the courtyard, determinedly not looking at him. The final match of the Quidditch season, Gryffindor versus Ravenclaw, was to take place on the last weekend of May. Although Slytherin had narrowly been defeated by Hufflepuff in their last match, Gryffindor was not daring to hope for victory, due mainly, though of course nobody said it to him, to Ron's abysmal goalkeeping record. He, however, seemed to have found a new optimism. "I mean, I can't get any worse, can I?" he told Harry and Hermione grimly over breakfast on the morning of the match. "Nothing to lose now, is there?" "You know," said Hermione as she and Harry walked down to the pitch a little later in the midst of a very excitable crowd, "I think Ron might do better without Fred and George around. They never exactly gave him a lot of confidence." Luna Lovegood overtook them with what appeared to be a live eagle perched on top of her head. "Oh gosh, I forgot!" said Hermione, watching the eagle flapping its wings as Luna walked serenely past a group of cackling and pointing Slytherins. "Cho will be playing, won't she?" Harry, who had not forgotten this, merely grunted. They found seats in the topmost row of the stands. It was a fine, clear day. Ron could not wish for better, and Harry found himself hoping against hope that Ron would not give the Slytherins cause for more rousing choruses of "Weasley is our king." Lee Jordan, who had been very dispirited since Fred and George had left, was commentating as usual. As the teams zoomed out onto the pitches, he named the players with something less than his usual gusto. "Bradley, Davies, Chang," he said, and Harry felt his stomach perform less of a backflip, more a feeble lurch as Cho walked out onto the pitch, her shiny black hair rippling in the slight breeze. He was not sure what he wanted to happen anymore, except that he could not stand any more rows. Even the sight of her chatting animatedly to Roger Davies as they prepared to mount their brooms caused him only a slight twinge of jealousy. "And they're off," said Lee. "And Davies takes the quaffle immediately. Ravenclaw Captain Davies with the quaffle. He dodges Johnson. He dodges Bell. He dodges Spinnet as well. He's going straight for the goal. He's going to shoot. And... Lee swore very loudly. "He's scored!" Harry and Hermione groaned with the rest of the Gryffindors. Predictably, horribly, the Slytherins on the other side of the stands began to sing. "Weasley cannot save a thing. He cannot block a single ring." "Harry," said a hoarse voice in Harry's ear. "Hermione." Harry looked around and saw Hagrid's enormous bearded face sticking between the seats. Apparently he had squeezed his way all along the row behind, for the first and second years had just had a ruffled, flattened look about them. For some reason, Hagrid was bent double as though anxious not to be seen, though he was still at least 4 feet taller than everybody else. "Listen," he whispered. "Can you come with me? Now, while everyone's watching the match." Can't it wait, Hagrid?" asked Harry. "Till the match is over?" "No," said Hagrid. "No, hurry. It's got to be now. While everyone's looking the other way. Please." Hagrid's nose was gently dripping blood. His eyes were both blackened. Harry had not seen him this close up since his return to the school. He looked utterly woebegone. "Course," said Harry at once. "Course will come." He and Hermione edged back along their row of seats, causing much grumbling among the students who had to stand up for them. The people in Hagrid's row were not complaining, merely attempting to make themselves as small as possible. "I appreciate this, you two. I really do," said Hagrid as they reached the stairs. He kept looking around nervously as they descended toward the lawn below.
I just hope she doesn't notice us going.
You mean Umbridge? Said Harry. She won't. She's got her whole inquisitorial squad sitting with her. Didn't you see? She must be expecting trouble at the match.
Yeah, well, a bit of trouble wouldn't hurt,
said Hagrid, pausing to peer around the edge of the stands to make sure the stretch of lawn between there and his cabin was deserted.
Give us more time.
What is it, Hagrid? Said Hermione, looking up at him with a concerned expression on her face as they hurried across the lawn toward the edge of the forest.
You'll see in a mo,
said Hagrid, looking over his shoulder as a great roar rose up from the stands behind them.
Hey, did someone just score?
It'll be Ravenclaw, said Harry heavily.
Good,
said Hagrid distractedly.
That's good.
They had to jog to keep up with him as he strode across the lawn, looking around with every other step. When they reached his cabin, Hermione turned automatically left toward the front door. Hagrid, however, walked straight past it into the shade of the trees on the outermost edge of the forest, where he picked up a crossbow that was leaning against a tree. When he realized they were no longer with him, he turned.
We're going in here,
he said, jerking his shaggy head behind him. Into the forest? Said Hermione, perplexed.
Yeah, said Hagrid. Come on now, quick, before we're spotted.
Harry and Hermione looked at each other, then ducked into the cover of the trees behind Hagrid, who was already striding away from them in the green gloom, his crossbow over his arm. Harry and Hermione ran to catch up with him. Hagrid, why are you armed? Said Harry.
Just a precaution,
said Hagrid, shrugging his massive shoulders. You didn't bring your crossbow the day you showed us the Thestrals, said Hermione timidly.
Nah, well, we weren't going in so far then, said Hagrid. And that was before Firenze left the forest, wasn't it?
Why does Firenze leaving make a difference? Asked Hermione curiously.
'Cause the other centaurs are good and riled at me, that's why, said Hagrid quietly, glancing around. They used to be, well, you couldn't call them friendly, but we got on all right. Kept themselves to themselves, but always turned up if I wanted a word. Not anymore.
He sighed deeply. Firenze said that they're angry because he went to work for Dumbledore, Harry asked, tripping on a protruding root because he was busy watching Hagrid's profile.
Yeah, said Hagrid heavily. Well, angry doesn't cover it. Ruddy livid. If I hadn't stepped in, I reckon they'd have kicked Firenze to death.
They attacked him? Said Hermione, sounding shocked.
Yup,
said Hagrid gruffly, forcing his way through several low-hanging branches.
He had half the herd onto him.
And you stopped it? Said Harry, amazed and impressed. By yourself?
Course I did. Couldn't stand by and watch him kill him, could I? Said Hagrid. Lucky I was passing, really. I'd have thought Firenze might have remembered that before he started sending me stupid warnings, he added hotly and unexpectedly.
Harry and Hermione looked at each other startled, but Hagrid, scowling, did not elaborate.
Anyway, he said, breathing a little more heavily than usual, since the other centaurs have been living with me, and the trouble is, they've got a lot of influence in the forest. Cleverest creatures in here.
Is that why we're here, Hagrid? Asked Hermione. The centaurs?
Ah, no, said Hagrid, shaking his head dismissively. No, it's not them. Well, of course, they could complicate the problem, yeah? But you'll see what I mean in a bit.
On this incomprehensible note, he fell silent and forged a little ahead, taking one stride for every 3 of theirs, so that they had great trouble keeping up with him. The path was becoming increasingly overgrown, and the trees grew so closely together as they walked farther and farther into the forest that it was as dark as dusk. Soon, they were a long way past the clearing where Hagrid had shown them the Thestrals. But Harry felt no sense of unease until Hagrid stepped unexpectedly off the path and began wending his way in and out of the trees toward the dark heart of the forest. Hagrid? Said Harry, fighting his way through the thickly knotted brambles over which Hagrid had stepped easily, and remembering very vividly what had happened to him on the other occasions he had stepped off the forest path. Where are we going?
Bit further, said Hagrid over his shoulder. Come on, Harry. We need to keep together now.
It was a great struggle to keep up with Hagrid, what with branches and thickets of thorn through which Hagrid marched as easily as though they were cobwebs, but which snagged Harry and Hermione's robes, frequently entangling them so severely that they had to stop for minutes at a time to free themselves. Harry's arms and legs were soon covered in small cuts and scratches. They were so deep in the forest now that sometimes all Harry could see of Hagrid in the gloom was a massive dark shape ahead of him. Any sound seemed threatening in the muffled silence. The breaking of a twig echoed loudly, and the tiniest rustle of movement, though it might have been made by an innocent sparrow, caused Harry to peer through the gloom for a culprit. It occurred to him that he had never managed to get this far into the forest without meeting some kind of creature. Their absence struck him as rather ominous. Hagrid, would it be all right if we lit our wands? Said Hermione quietly.
Oh, all right,
Hagrid whispered back.
in fact.
He stopped suddenly and turned around. Hermione walked right into him and was knocked over backward. Harry caught her just before she hit the forest floor.
Maybe we best just stop for a moment so I can fill you in, said Hagrid, before we get there, like.
Good, said Hermione as Harry set her back on her feet. They both murmured, Lumos, and their wand tips ignited. Hagrid's face swam through the gloom by the light of the two wavering beams, and Harry saw that he looked nervous and sad again.
Right, said Hagrid. Well, see, the thing is...
He took a great breath.
Well, there's a good chance I'm going to be getting the sack any day now, he said.
Harry and Hermione looked at each other, then back at him.
But you've lasted this long,
Hermione said tentatively. What makes you think...
Umbridge reckons it was me that put that niffler in her office.
And was it? Said Harry before he could stop himself.
No, it pretty well wasn't,
said Hagrid indignantly.
Only anything to do with magical creatures, and she thinks it's got something to do with me. You know, she's been looking for a chance to get rid of me ever since I got back. I don't want to go, of course, but if it wasn't for, well, special circumstances I'm about to explain to you, I'd leave right now before she's gotten a chance to do it in front of the whole school like she did with Trelawney.
Harry and Hermione both made noises of protest, but Hagrid overrode them with a wave of one of his enormous hands.
It's not the end of the world. I'll be able to help Dumbledore once I'm out of here. I can be useful to the Order. And you lot'll have Grubbly Plank. You'll get through your exams fine.
His voice trembled and broke.
Don't worry about me,
he said hastily as Hermione made to pat his arm. He pulled his enormous spotted handkerchief from the pocket of his waistcoat and mopped his eyes with it.
Look, I wouldn't be telling you this at all if I didn't have to. See, if I go, well, I can't leave without telling someone, because I'll need you two to help me. And Ron, if he's willing.
Of course we'll help you, said Harry at once. What do you want us to do? Hagrid gave a great sniff and patted Harry wordlessly on the shoulder with such force that Harry was knocked sideways into a tree.
I knew you'd say yes,
said Hagrid into his handkerchief.
But I won't never forget. Well, come on, just a little bit further through here. Watch yourselves now, there's nettles.
They walked on in silence for another 15 minutes. Harry had opened his mouth to ask how much farther they had to go when Hagrid threw out his right arm to signal that they should stop.
Really easy, he said softly. Very quiet now.
They crept forward, and Harry saw that they were facing a large, smooth mound of earth nearly as tall as Hagrid, that he thought, with a jolt of dread, was sure to be the lair of some enormous animal. Trees had been ripped up at the roots all around the mound, so that it stood on a bare patch of ground surrounded by heaps of trunks and boughs that formed a kind of fence or barricade, behind which Harry and Hermione and Hagrid now stood.
Sleeping,
breathed Hagrid. Sure enough, Harry could hear a distant rhythmic rumbling that sounded like a pair of enormous lungs at work. He glanced sideways at Hermione, who was gazing at the mound with her mouth slightly open. She looked utterly terrified. Hagrid, she said in a whisper barely audible over the sound of the sleeping creature. Who is he? Harry found this an odd question. What is it? Was the one he had been planning on asking. Hagrid, you told us, said Hermione, her wand now shaking in her hand. You told us none of them wanted to come. Harry looked from her to Hagrid, and then, as realization hit him, he looked back at the mound with a small gasp of horror. The great mound of earth on which he, Hermione, and Hagrid could easily have stood was moving slowly, up and down, in time with the deep, grunting breathing. It was not a mound at all. It was the curved back of what was clearly...
Well, no, he didn't want to come, said Hagrid, sounding desperate. But I had to bring him, Hermione, I had to.
But why? Asked Hermione, who sounded as though she wanted to cry. Why? What? Oh, Hagrid!
I knew if I just got him back, said Hagrid, sounding close to tears himself, and taught him a few manners, I'd be able to take him outside and show everyone he's harmless.
Harmless?
Said Hermione shrilly, and Hagrid made a frantic hushing noises with his hands as the enormous creature before them grunted loudly and shifted in its sleep.
He's been hurting you all this time, hasn't he? That's why you've had all these injuries.
He don't know his own strength, said Hagrid earnestly, and he's getting better. He's not fighting so much anymore.
So this is why you took 2 months to get home, said Hermione distractedly. Oh, Hagrid, why did you bring him back if he didn't want to come? Wouldn't he have been happier with his own people?
They were bullying him, Hermione, because he's so small, said Hagrid.
Small? Said Hermione. Small?
Hermione, I couldn't leave him,
said Hagrid, tears now trickling down his bruised face into his beard.
See? He's my brother.
Hermione simply stared at him, her mouth open. Hagrid, when you say brother, said Harry slowly, do you mean...
Well, half-brother,
amended Hagrid.
Turns out me mother took up with another giant when she left me dad, and she went and had Grop here.
Grop? Said Harry.
Yeah, well, that's what it sounds like when he says his name,
said Hagrid anxiously.
He don't speak a lot of English. I've been trying to teach him. Anyway, she don't seem to have liked him much more than she liked me. See, with giantesses, what counts is producing good big kids, and he's always been a bit on the runty side for a giant. Only 16 foot.
Oh, yes, tiny,
said Hermione with a kind of hysterical sarcasm.
Absolutely minuscule.
He was being kicked around by all of them. I just couldn't leave him.
Did Madame Maxime want to bring him back? Asked Harry.
Well, she could see it was right important to me,
said Hagrid, twisting his enormous hands.
But she got a bit tired of him after a while, I must admit. So we split up on the journey home. She promised not to tell anyone, though.
How on earth did you get him back without anyone noticing? Said Harry.
Well, that's why it took so long, see? Said Hagrid. Could only travel by night and through wild country and stuff. Of course, he covers the ground pretty well when he wants to, but he kept wanting to go back.
Oh, Hagrid, why on earth didn't you let him?
Said Hermione, flopping down onto a ripped-up tree and burying her face in her hands.
What do you think you're going to do with a violent giant who doesn't even want to be here?
Well, now, violent? That's a bit harsh,
said Hagrid, still twisting his hands agitatedly.
I'll admit he might have taken a couple of swings at me when he's been in a bad mood, but he's getting better, loads better, settling down well.
What are those ropes for, then? Harry asked. He had just noticed ropes thick as saplings stretching from around the trunks of the largest nearby trees toward the place where Grop lay curled on the ground with his back to them.
You have to keep him tied up,
said Hermione faintly.
Well, yeah,
said Hagrid, looking anxious.
See, it's like I say, he doesn't really know his own strength.
Harry understood now why there had been such a suspicious lack of any other living creature in this part of the forest.
So what is it you want Harry and Ron and me to do?
Hermione asked apprehensively.
Look after him,
said Hagrid croakily.
After I'm gone.
Harry and Hermione exchanged miserable looks, Harry uncomfortably aware that he had already promised Hagrid that he would do whatever he asked.
What does that involve, exactly?
Hermione inquired.
Not food or anything,
said Hagrid eagerly.
He can get his own food, no problem. Birds and deer and stuff. No, it's company he needs. If I just knew someone was carrying on, trying to help him a bit, teaching him, you know.
Harry said nothing, but looked back at the gigantic form lying asleep on the ground in front of them. Grop had his back to them. Unlike Hagrid, who simply looked like a very oversized human, Grop looked strangely misshapen. What Harry had taken to be a vast mossy boulder to the left of the earthen mound he now recognized as Grop's head. It was much larger in proportion to the body than a human head, almost perfectly round and covered with tightly curling, close-growing hair the color of bracken. The rim of a single, large, fleshy ear was visible on top of the head, which seemed to sit rather like Uncle Vernon's, directly upon the shoulders with little or no neck in between. The back, under what looked like a dirty brownish smock comprised of animal skins sewn roughly together, was very broad, and as Grop slept, it seemed to strain a little at the rough seams of the skins. The legs were curled up under the body. Harry could see the soles of enormous, filthy bare feet, large as sledges, resting one on top of the other on the earthy forest floor. "You want us to teach him," Harry said in a hollow voice. He now understood what Firenze's warning had meant. His attempt is not working. He would do better to abandon it. Of course, the other creatures who lived in the forest would have heard Hagrid's fruitless attempts to teach Grop English.
"Yeah, if you just talk to him a bit,"
said Hagrid hopefully.
"'Cause I reckon if he can talk to people, he'll understand more, that we all like him and we want him to stay."
Harry looked at Hermione, who peered back at him from between the fingers over her face.
"Kind of makes you wish we had Norbert back, doesn't it?" she said, and she gave a very shaky laugh.
"You'll do it then?"
said Hagrid, who did not seem to have caught what Hermione had just said. "Well," said Harry, already bound by his promise. "We'll try, Hagrid."
"I knew I could count on you, Harry,"
Hagrid said, beaming in a very watery way and dabbing his face with his handkerchief again.
"And I don't want you to put yourself out too much. I know you've got exams. If you could just nip down here in your invisibility cloak maybe once a week and have a little chat with him. I'll wake him up then, introduce you."
"What? No!" said Hermione, jumping up. "Hagrid, no! Don't wake him! Really, we don't need—" But Hagrid had already stepped over the great trunk in front of them and was proceeding toward Grop. When he was around 10 feet away, he lifted a long broken bough from the ground, smiled reassuringly over his shoulder at Harry and Hermione, and then poked Grop hard in the middle of the back with the end of the bough. The giant gave a roar that echoed around the silent forest. Birds in the treetops overhead rose, twittering from their perches, and soared away. In front of Harry and Hermione, meanwhile, the gigantic Grop was rising from the ground, which shuddered as he placed an enormous hand upon it to push himself onto his knees and turned his head to see who and what had disturbed him.
"All right, Groppy,"
said Hagrid in a would-be cheery voice, backing away with the long bough raised, ready to poke Grop again.
"Had a nice sleep, eh?"
Harry and Hermione retreated as far as they could while still keeping the giant within their sights. Grop knelt between two trees he had not yet uprooted. They looked up into his startlingly huge face, which resembled a gray full moon swimming in the gloom of the clearing. It was as though the features had been hewn onto a great stone ball. The nose was stubby and shapeless, the mouth lopsided and full of misshapen yellow teeth the size of half bricks. The small eyes were a muddy greenish-brown, and just now were half gummed together with sleep. Grop raised dirty knuckles, as big as cricket balls, to his eyes, rubbed vigorously, then, without warning, pushed himself to his feet with surprising speed and agility.
"Oh my!"
Harry heard Hermione squeal, terrified beside him. The trees, to which the other ends of the ropes around Grop's wrists and ankles were attached, creaked ominously. He was, as Hagrid had said, at least 16 feet tall. Gazing blearily around, he reached out a hand the size of a beach umbrella, seized a bird's nest from the upper branches of a towering pine, and turned it upside down with a roar of apparent displeasure that there was no bird in it. Eggs fell like grenades toward the ground, and Hagrid threw his arms over his head to protect himself.
"Anyway, Groppy,"
shouted Hagrid, looking up apprehensively in case of further falling eggs,
"I've brought some friends to meet you. Remember that I told you I might? Remember when I said I might have to go on a little trip and leave them to look after you for a bit? Remember that, Groppy?"
But Grop merely gave another low roar. It was hard to say whether he was listening to Hagrid or whether he even recognized the sounds Hagrid was making his speech. He had now seized the top of the pine tree and was pulling it toward him, evidently for the simple pleasure of seeing how far back it would spring when he let it go.
"Now, Grop, don't do that!" shouted Hagrid. "That's how you end up pulling up the others!"
And sure enough, Harry could see the earth around the tree's roots beginning to crack.
"I got company for you!" Hagrid shouted. "Company, see? Look down, you big buffoon! I brought you some friends!"
"Oh, Hagrid, don't!" moaned Hermione, but Hagrid had already raised the bough again and gave Grop's knee a sharp poke. The giant let go of the top of the pine tree, which swayed menacingly and deluged Hagrid with a rain of needles, and looked down.
"This,"
said Hagrid, hastening over to where Harry and Hermione stood,
"is Harry, Grop. Harry Potter. He might be coming to visit you if I have to go away, understand?"
The giant had only just realized that Harry and Hermione were there. They watched in great trepidation as he lowered his huge boulder of a head so that he could peer blearily at them.
"And this is Hermione, see?
Hagrid hesitated. Turning to Hermione, he said,
"Would you mind if he called you Hermione? Only it's a difficult name for him to remember."
"No, not at all,"
squeaked Hermione.
"This is Hermy, Grop, and she's going to be coming and all. Isn't that nice, eh? Two friends for you to—" "Groppy, no!"
Grop's hand shot out of nowhere toward Hermione. Harry seized her and pulled her backward behind the tree so that Grop's fist scraped the trunk but closed on thin air.
"Bad boy, Groppy!"
Harry heard Hagrid yelling as Hermione clung to Harry behind the tree, shaking and whimpering.
"Very bad boy! You don't grab— Gosh!"
Harry poked his head out from around the trunk and saw Hagrid lying on his back, his hand over his nose. Grop, apparently losing interest, had straightened up again and was again engaged in pulling back the pine as far as it would go.
"Right,"
said Hagrid thickly, getting up with one hand and pinching his bleeding nose, grabbing the crossbow.
"Well, there you are. You've met him, and now he'll know you when you come back. Yeah, Well,
He looked up at Grubb, who was now pulling back the pine with an expression of detached pleasure on his boulderish face. The roots were creaking as he ripped them away from the ground.
well, I reckon that's enough for one day, said Hagrid. We'll go back now, shall we?
Harry and Hermione nodded. Hagrid shouldered his crossbow again and, still pinching his nose, led the way back into the trees. Nobody spoke for a while, not even when they heard the distant crash that meant Grubb had pulled over the pine tree at last. Hermione's face was pale and set. Harry could not think of a single thing to say. What on earth was going to happen when somebody found out that Hagrid had hidden Grubb in the forest? And he had promised that he, Ron, and Hermione would continue Hagrid's totally pointless attempts to civilize the giant. How could Hagrid, even with his immense capacity to delude himself with that fanged monsters were lovable and harmless, fool himself that Grubb would ever be fit to mix with humans?
Hold it,
said Hagrid abruptly, just as Harry and Hermione were struggling through a patch of thick knotgrass behind him. He pulled an arrow out of the quiver over his shoulder and fitted it into the crossbow. Harry and Hermione raised their wands now that they had stopped walking. They, too, could hear movement close by.
Oh, blimey,
said Hagrid quietly. I thought that we told you, Hagrid, said a deep male voice, that you are no longer welcome here. A man's naked torso seemed for an instant to be floating toward them through the dappled green half-light. Then they saw that his waist joined smoothly with a horse's chestnut body. This centaur had a proud, high cheekboned face and long black hair. Like Hagrid, he was armed. A quiver full of arrows and a long bow were slung over his shoulders.
How are you, Megorian?
Said Hagrid warily. The trees behind the centaur rustled, and 4 or 5 emerged behind him. Harry recognized the black-bodied and bearded Bane, whom he had met nearly 4 years ago on the same night he had met Firenze. Bane gave no sign that he had ever seen Harry before. So, he said with a nasty inflection in his voice before turning immediately to Megorian, we agreed, I think, what we would do if this human showed his face in the forest again.
This human now, am I? Said Hagrid testily. Just for stopping all of you committing murder?
You ought not to have meddled, Hagrid, said Megorian. Our ways are not yours, nor are our laws. Firenze has betrayed and dishonored us.
I don't know how you worked that out, said Hagrid impatiently. He's done nothing except help Albus Dumbledore.
Firenze has entered into servitude to humans, said a grey centaur with a hard, deeply lined face.
Servitude, said Hagrid scathingly. He's doing Dumbledore a favour is all.
He is peddling our knowledge and secrets among humans, said Megorian quietly. There can be no return from such disgrace.
If you say so, said Hagrid shrugging. But personally, I think you're making a big mistake.
As are you, human, said Bane, coming back into our forest
when we warned you. Now you listen to me, said Hagrid angrily. I'll have less of the our forest if it's all the same to you. It's not up to you who comes and goes in here.
No more is it up to you, Hagrid, said Megorian smoothly. I shall let you pass today because you are accompanied by your young.
They're not his, interrupted Bane contemptuously. Students, Megorian, from up at the school. They've probably already profited from the traitor Firenze's teachings.
Nevertheless, said Megorian calmly, the slaughter of foals is a terrible crime. We do not touch the innocent. Today, Hagrid, you pass. Henceforth, stay away from this place. You forfeited the friendship of the centaurs when you helped the traitor Firenze escape us.
I won't be kept out of the forest by a bunch of mules like you, said Hagrid loudly.
Hagrid, said Hermione in a high-pitched and terrified voice as both Bane and the grey centaur pawed at the ground. Let's go, please, let's go. Hagrid moved forward, but his crossbow was still raised, and his eyes were still fixed threateningly upon Megorian. We know what you are keeping in the forest, Hagrid, Megorian called after them as the centaur slipped out of sight. And our tolerance is waning. Hagrid turned and gave every appearance of wanting to walk straight back to Megorian again.
You'll tolerate him as long as he's here. It's as much as his force as yours, he yelled,
while Harry and Hermione both pushed with all their might against Hagrid's moleskin waistcoat in an effort to keep him moving forward. Still scowling, he looked down. His expression changed to mild surprise at the sight of them both pushing him. He seemed not to have felt it.
Calm down, you two, he said, turning to walk on while they panted along beside him. Ruddy old nags, though, eh?
Hagrid, said Hermione breathlessly, skirting the patch of nettles they had passed on their way there. If the centaurs don't want humans in the forest, it doesn't really look as though Harry and I will be able to...
You heard what they said.
said Hagrid dismissively.
They wouldn't hurt foals. I mean, kids. Anyway, we can't let ourselves be pushed around by that lot.
Nice try, Harry murmured to Hermione, who looked crestfallen. At last, they rejoined the path, and after another 10 minutes, the trees began to thin. They were able to see patches of clear blue sky again, and hear in the distance the definite sounds of cheering and shouting.
Was that another goal?
Asked Hagrid, pausing in the shelter of the trees as the Quidditch stadium came into view.
Or do you reckon the match is over?
I don't know, said Hermione miserably. Harry saw that she looked much the worse for wear. Her hair was full of bits of twigs and leaves, her robes were ripped in several places, and there were numerous scratches on her face and arms. He knew he could look little better.
I reckon it's over,
said Hagrid, still squinting toward the stadium.
Look, there's people coming out already. If you two hurry, you'll be able to blend in with the crowd, and no one will know you weren't there.
Good idea, said Harry. Well, see you later then, Hagrid. I don't believe him, said Hermione in a very unsteady voice the moment they were out of earshot of Hagrid. I don't believe him. I really don't believe him. Calm down, said Harry. Calm down, she said feverishly. A giant in the forest. And we're supposed to give him English lessons? And always assuming, of course, we can get past the herd of murderous centaurs on the way in and out. I don't believe him. We haven't got to do anything yet. Harry tried to reassure her in a quiet voice as they joined a stream of jabbering Hufflepuffs heading back toward the castle. He's not asking us to do anything unless he gets chucked out, and that might not even happen. Oh, come off it, Harry, said Hermione angrily, stopping dead in her tracks so that the people behind her had to swerve to avoid her. Of course he's going to be chucked out, and to be perfectly honest, after what we've just seen, who can blame Umbridge? There was a pause, in which Harry glared at her, and her eyes filled slowly with tears. You didn't mean that, said Harry quietly. No, well, all right, I didn't, she said, wiping her eyes angrily. But why does he have to make life so difficult for himself? For us? I don't know. Weasley is our king. Weasley is our king. He didn't let the quaffle in. Weasley is our king. And I wish they'd stop singing that stupid song, said Hermione miserably. Haven't they gloated enough? A great tide of students was moving up the sloping lawns from the pitch. Oh, let's get in before we have to meet the Slytherins, said Hermione. Weasley can save anything. He never leaves a single ring. That's why Gryffindors all sing. Weasley is our king. Hermione, said Harry slowly, but the song was growing louder. But it was issuing not from a crowd of green and silver-clad Slytherins, but from a mass of red and gold, moving slowly toward the castle, which was bearing a solitary figure upon its many shoulders. Weasley is our king. Weasley is our king. He didn't let the quaffle in. Weasley is our king. No, said Hermione in a hushed voice. Yes, said Harry loudly. Harry, Hermione, yelled Ron, waving the silver Quidditch cup in the air and looking quite beside himself. We did it! We won! They beamed up at him as he passed. There was a scrum at the door of the castle, and Ron's head got rather badly bumped on the lintel, but nobody seemed to want to put him down. Still singing, the crowd squeezed itself into the entrance hall and out of sight. Harry and Hermione watched them go, beaming, until the last echoing strains of Weasley is our king died away. Then they turned to each other, their smiles fading. We'll save our news till tomorrow, shall we? Said Harry. Yeah, all right, said Hermione wearily. I'm not in any hurry. They climbed the steps together. At the front doors, both instinctively looked back at the Forbidden Forest. Harry was not sure whether it was his imagination or not, but he rather thought he saw a small cloud of birds erupting into the air over the treetops in the distance, almost as though the tree in which they had been nesting had just been pulled up by the roots. Chapter 31. OWLs. Ron's euphoria at helping Gryffindor scrape the Quidditch Cup was such that he could not settle to anything the next day. All he wanted to do was talk over the match, and Harry and Hermione found it very difficult to find an opening in which to mention Grawp. Not that either of them tried very hard. Neither was keen to be the one to bring Ron back to reality in quite such a brutal fashion. As it was another fine, warm day, they persuaded him to join them in studying under the beech tree on the edge of the lake, where they stood less chance of being overheard than in the common room. Ron was not particularly keen on this idea at first. He was thoroughly enjoying being patted on the back by the Gryffindors walking past his chair, not to mention the occasional outbursts of Weasley as our king, but agreed after a while that some fresh air might do him good. They spread their books out in the shade of the beech tree and sat down while Ron talked them through his first save of the match for what felt like the dozenth time.
Well, I mean, I'd already let in that one of Davies, so I wasn't feeling that confident, but I don't know. When Bradley came toward me just out of nowhere, I thought, you can do this. And I had about a second to decide which way to fly, because he looked like he was aiming for the right goal hoop. My right, obviously, his left, but I had a funny feeling he was feinting. So I took the chance and flew left, his right. Well, you saw what happened, he concluded modestly, sweeping his hair back quite unnecessarily so that it looked interestingly windswept, and glancing around to see whether the people nearest to them, a bunch of gossiping third-year Hufflepuffs, had heard him. And then when Chambers came at me about 5 minutes later...
What? Ron said, stopping mid-sentence at the look on Harry's face. Why are you grinning? I'm not, said Harry quickly, looking down at his transfiguration notes and attempting to straighten his face. The truth was that Ron had just reminded Harry forcibly of another Gryffindor Quidditch player who had once sat rumpling his hair under this very tree. I'm just glad we won, that's all.
Yeah, said Ron slowly, savoring the words. We won. Did you see the look on Chang's face when Ginny got the snitch right from under her nose?
I suppose she cried, did she? Said Harry bitterly.
Well, yeah, more out of temper than anything, though.
Ron frowned slightly.
But you saw her chuck her broom away when she got back to the ground, didn't you?
Said Harry.
Well, actually... No, Ron,
said Hermione with a heavy sigh, putting down her book and looking at him apologetically.
As a matter of fact, the only bit of the match Harry and I saw was Davies' first goal.
Ron's carefully ruffled hair seemed to wilt with disappointment.
You didn't watch? He said faintly, looking from one to the other. You didn't see me make any of those saves?
Well, no,
said Hermione, stretching out a placatory hand toward him.
But, Ron, we didn't want to leave. We had to.
Yeah? Said Ron, whose face was growing rather red. How come?
It was Hagrid, said Harry. He decided to tell us why he's been covered in injuries ever since he got back from the Giants. He wanted us to go into the forest with him. We had no choice. You know how he gets. Anyway,
the story was told in 5 minutes, by the end of which Ron's indignation had been replaced by a look of total incredulity.
He brought one back and hid it in the forest?
Yep, said Harry grimly.
No,
said Ron, as though saying this he could make it untrue.
No, he can't have.
Well, he has, said Hermione firmly. Grop's about 16 feet tall, enjoys ripping up 20-foot pine trees, and knows me, she snorted, as Hermie.
Ron gave a nervous laugh.
And Hagrid wants us to
teach him English. Yeah, said Harry.
He's lost his mind,
said Ron in an almost awed voice. Yes, said Hermione irritably, turning the page of Intermediate Transfiguration and glaring at a series of diagrams showing an owl turning into a pair of opera glasses.
Yes, I'm starting to think he has. But unfortunately, he made Harry and me promise.
Well, you're just going to have to break your promise, that's all, said Ron firmly. I mean, come on. We've got exams and we're about that far.
He held up his hand to show thumb and forefinger a millimeter apart.
From being chucked out as it is. And anyway, remember Norbert? Remember Aragog? Have we ever come off better for mixing with any of Hagrid's monster mates?
I know, it's just that we promised,
said Hermione in a small voice. Ron smoothed his hair flat again, looking preoccupied.
Well, he sighed, Hagrid hasn't been sacked yet, has he? He's hung on this long. Maybe he'll hang on till the end of term and we won't have to go near Grop at all.
The castle grounds were gleaming in the sunlight as though freshly painted. The cloudless sky smiled at itself in the smoothly sparkling lake. The satin green lawns rippled occasionally in the gentle breeze. June had arrived. But to the fifth years, this meant only one thing. Their OWLs were upon them at last. Their teachers were no longer setting them homework. Lessons were devoted to reviewing those topics their teachers thought likely to come up in the exams. The purposeful, feverish atmosphere drove nearly everything but the owls from Harry's mind, though he did wonder occasionally during potions lessons whether Lupin had ever told Snape that he must continue giving Harry occlumency tuition. If he had, then Snape had ignored Lupin as thoroughly as he was now ignoring Harry. This suited Harry very well. He was quite busy and tense enough without extra classes with Snape, and to his relief, Hermione was much too preoccupied these days to badger him about occlumency. She was spending a lot of time muttering to herself and had not laid out any elf clothes for days. She was not the only person acting oddly as the OWLs drew steadily nearer. Ernie Macmillan had developed an irritating habit of interrogating people about their study habits. "How many hours do you think you're doing a day?" he demanded of Harry and Ron as they queued outside herbology, a manic gleam in his eyes. "I don't know," said Ron. "A few. More or less than 8. "Less, I suppose," said Ron, looking slightly alarmed. "I'm doing 8, said Ernie, puffing out his chest. 8 or 9. I'm getting about an hour in before breakfast every day. 8's my average. I can do 10 on a good weekend day. I did 9.5 on Monday. Not so good on Tuesday, only 7.25. Then on Wednesday." Harry was deeply thankful for Professor Sprout ushering them into the Greenhouse 3 at that point, forcing Ernie to abandon his recital. Meanwhile, Draco Malfoy had found a different way to induce panic. "Of course, it's not what you know," he was heard to tell Crabbe and Goyle loudly outside potions a few days before the exams were to start. "It's who you know. Now, Father's been friendly with the head of the Wizarding Examinations Authority for years. Old Griselda Marchbanks. We've had her round for dinner and everything." "Do you think that's true?" Hermione whispered to Harry and Ron, looking frightened. "Nothing we can do about it if it is," said Ron gloomily. "I don't think it's true," said Neville quietly from behind them, "because Griselda Marchbanks is a friend of my Gran's, and she's never mentioned the Malfoys." "What's she like, Neville?" said Hermione at once. "Is she strict?" "Bit like Gran, really," said Neville in a subdued voice. "Knowing her won't hurt your chances, though, will it?" Ron told him encouragingly. "Oh, I don't think it will make any difference," said Neville, still more miserably. "Gran's always telling Professor Marchbanks I'm not as good as my dad." "Well, you saw what she's like at St. Mungo's." Neville looked fixedly at the floor. Harry, Ron, and Hermione glanced at one another, but didn't know what to say. It was the first time that Neville had acknowledged that they had met at the Wizarding Hospital. Meanwhile, a flourishing black market trade in aids to concentration, mental agility, and wakefulness had sprung up among the 5th and 7th years. Harry and Ron were much tempted by the bottle of Baruffio's brain elixir offered to them by Ravenclaw's 6th year, Eddie Carmichael, who swore it was solely responsible for the 9 outstanding owls he had gained the previous summer, and was offering the whole pint for a mere 12 galleons. Ron assured Harry he would reimburse him for his half the moment he left Hogwarts and got a job, but before they could close the deal, Hermione had confiscated the bottle from Carmichael and poured the contents down a toilet. "Hermione, we wanted to buy that!" shouted Ron. "Don't be stupid," she snarled. "You might as well take Harold Dingle's powdered Dragonclaw and have done with it." "Dingle's got powdered Dragonclaw?" said Ron eagerly. "Not anymore," said Hermione. "I confiscated that too. None of these things actually works, you know." "Dragonclaw does work," said Ron. "It's supposed to be incredible. Really gives your brain a boost. You come over all cunning for a few hours." "Hermione, let me have a pinch. Go on, it can't hurt." "This stuff can," said Hermione grimly. "I've had a look at it, and it's actually dried doxy droppings." This information took the edge off Harry and Ron's desire for brain stimulants. They received their examination schedules and details of the procedure for OWLs during their next Transfiguration lesson. "As you can see," Professor McGonagall told the class while they copied down the dates and times of their exams from the blackboard, "your OWLs are spread over 2 successive weeks. You will sit the theory exams in the morning and the practice in the afternoons. Your practical astronomy examination will, of course, take place at night. Now, I must warn you that the most stringent anti-cheating charms have been applied to your examination papers. Auto-answer quills are banned from the examination hall, as are remembrals, detachable cribbling cuffs, and self-correcting ink. Every year, I'm afraid to say, seems to harbor at least one student who thinks that he or she can get around the Wizarding Examinations Authority's rules. I can only hope it is nobody in Gryffindor. Our new headmistress," Professor McGonagall pronounced the word with the same look on her face that Aunt Petunia had whenever she was contemplating a particularly stubborn bit of dirt, "has asked the heads of house to tell their students that cheating will be punished most severely, because, of course, your examination results will reflect upon the headmistress's new regime at the school." Professor McGonagall gave a tiny sigh. Harry saw the nostrils of her sharp nose flare. "However, that is no reason not to do your very best. You have your own futures to think about." "Please, Professor," said Hermione, her hand in the air, "when will we find out our results?" "An owl will be sent you sometime in July," said Professor McGonagall. "Excellent," said Dean Thomas in an audible whisper, "so we don't have to worry about it till the holidays." Harry imagined sitting in his bedroom in Privet Drive in 6 weeks' time, waiting for his OWL results. Well, he thought, at least he would be sure of one bit of post next summer. Their first exam, Theory of Charms, was scheduled for Monday morning. Harry agreed to test Hermione after lunch on Sunday, but regretted it almost at once. She was very agitated and kept snatching the book back from him to check that she had gotten the answer completely right, finally hitting him hard on the nose with the sharp edge of achievements in charming. "Why don't you just do it yourself?" he said firmly, handing the book back to her, his eyes watering. Meanwhile, Ron was reading 2 years of charms notes with his fingers in his ears, his lips moving soundlessly. Seamus was lying flat on his back on the floor, reciting the definition of a substantive charm, while Dean checked it against the Standard Book of Spells, Grade 5, and Parvati and Lavender, who were practicing basic locomotion charms, were making their pencil cases race around each other at the edge of the table. Dinner was a subdued affair that night. Harry and Ron did not talk much, but ate with gusto, having studied hard all day. Hermione, on the other hand, kept putting down her knife and fork and diving under the table for her bag, from which she would seize a book to check some fact or figure. Ron was just telling her that she ought to eat a decent meal, or she would not sleep that night, when her fork slid from her limp fingers and landed with a loud tinkle on her plate. "Oh my goodness," she said faintly, staring into the entrance hall. "Is that them? Is that the examiners?" Harry and Ron whipped around on their bench. Through the doors to the great hall, they could see Umbridge, standing with a small group of ancient-looking witches and wizards. Umbridge, Harry was pleased to see, was looking rather nervous. "Shall we go and have a closer look?" said Ron. Harry and Hermione nodded, and they hastened toward the double doors into the entrance hall, slowing down as they stepped over the threshold to walk sedately past the examiners. Harry thought Professor Marchbanks must be the tiny, stooped witch with a face so lined it looked as though it had been draped in cobwebs. Umbridge was speaking to her very deferentially. Professor Marchbanks seemed to be a little deaf. She was answering Umbridge very loudly, considering that they were only a foot apart. "Journey was fine. Journey was fine. We've made it plenty of times before," she said impatiently. "Now, I haven't heard from Dumbledore lately," she added, peering around the hall as though hopeful he might suddenly emerge from a broom cupboard. "No idea where he is, I suppose?" "Not at all," said Umbridge, shooting a malevolent look at Harry, Ron, and Hermione, who were now dawdling around the foot of the stairs, as Ron pretended to do up his shoelace. "But I dare say the Minister of Magic will track him down soon enough." "I doubt it," shouted the tiny Professor Marchbanks. "Not if Dumbledore doesn't want to be found. I should know. Examined him personally in Transfiguration and Charms when he did NEWTs. Did things with a wand I'd never seen before." "Yes, well," said Professor Umbridge as Harry, Ron, and Hermione dragged their feet up the marble staircase as slowly as they dared. "Let me show you to the staff room. I dare say you'd like a cup of tea after your journey." It was an uncomfortable sort of an evening. Everyone was trying to do some last-minute studying, but nobody seemed to be getting very far. Harry went to bed early, but then lay awake for what felt like hours. He remembered his careers consultation and McGonagall's furious declaration that she would help him become an Auror if it was the last thing she did. He wished he had expressed a more achievable ambition now that exam time was here. He knew that he was not the only one lying awake, but none of the others in the dormitory spoke. And finally, one by one, they fell asleep. None of the fifth years talked very much at breakfast next day either. Parvati was practicing incantations under her breath, while the salt cellar in front of her twitched. Hermione was rereading Achievement in Charming so fast her eyes appeared blurred, and Neville kept dropping his knife and fork and knocking over the marmalade. Once breakfast was over, the 5th and 7th years milled around in the entrance hall, while the other students went off to lessons. Then, at 9:30, they were called forward class by class to re-enter the Great Hall, which was now arranged exactly as Harry had seen it in the Pensieve, when his father, Sirius, and Snape had been taking their OWLs. The 4 house tables had been removed and replaced instead with many tables for one, all facing the staff table end of the hall, where Professor McGonagall stood facing them. When they were all seated and quiet, she said, "You may begin," and turned over an enormous hourglass on the desk beside her, on which were also spare quills, ink bottles, and rolls of parchment. Harry turned over his paper, his heart thumping hard. 3 rows to his right and 4 seats ahead, Hermione was already scribbling. He lowered his eyes to the first question. A. Give the incantation, and B. Describe the wand movement required to make objects fly. Harry had a fleeting memory of a club soaring high into the air and landing loudly on the thick skull of a troll. Smiling slightly, he bent over the paper and began to write. "Well, it wasn't too bad, was it?" asked Hermione anxiously in the entrance hall 2 hours later, still clutching the exam paper. "I'm not sure I did myself justice on cheering charms. I just ran out of time. Did you put in the counter charm for hiccups? I wasn't sure whether I ought to. I felt like it might be too much. And on question 23... "Hermione," said Ron sternly, "we've been through this before. We're not going through every exam afterward. It's bad enough doing them once. The fifth years ate lunch with the rest of the school. The 4 house tables reappeared over the lunch hour, and then trooped off into the small chamber beside the great hall, where they were to wait until called for their practical examination. As small groups of students were called forward in alphabetical order, those left behind muttered incantations and practiced wand movements, occasionally poking one another in the back or eye by mistake. Hermione's name was called. Trembling, she left the chamber with Anthony Goldstein, Gregory Goyle, and Daphne Greengrass. Students who had already been tested did not return afterwards, so Harry and Ron had no idea how Hermione had done.
She'll be fine. Remember she got 112% on one of our charms tests? Said Ron.
10 minutes later, Professor Flitwick called, Parkinson Pansy, Patil Padma, Patil Pavati, Potter Harry.
Good luck,
said Ron quietly. Harry walked into the great hall, clutching his wand so tightly his hands shook. Professor Tofty is free, Potter, squeaked Professor Flitwick, who was standing just inside the door. He pointed Harry toward what looked like the very oldest and baldest examiner, who was sitting behind a small table in a far corner, a short distance from Professor Marchbanks, who was halfway through testing Draco Malfoy.
Potter, is it?
Said Professor Tofty, consulting his notes and peering over his pince-nez at the Harry as he approached.
The famous Potter?
Out of the corner of his eye, Harry distinctly saw Malfoy throw a scathing look over at him. The wine glass Malfoy had been levitating fell to the floor and smashed. Harry could not suppress a grin. Professor Tofty smiled back at him encouragingly.
That's it,
he said in his quavery old voice.
No need to be nervous. Now, if I could ask you to take this egg cup and make it do some cartwheels for me.
On the whole, Harry thought it went rather well. His levitation charm was certainly much better than Malfoy's had been, though he wished he had not mixed up the incantations for color change and growth charms, so that the rat he was supposed to be turning orange swelled shockingly and was the size of a badger before Harry could rectify his mistake. He was glad Hermione had not been in the hall at the time, and neglected to mention it afterward. He could tell Ron, though. Ron had caused the dinner plate to mutate into a large mushroom and had no idea how it happened. There was no time to relax that night. They went straight into the common room after dinner and submerged themselves in studying for Transfiguration the next day. Harry went to bed, his head buzzing with complex spell models and theories. He forgot the definition of a switching spell during his written exam next morning, but thought his practical could have been a lot worse. At least he managed to vanish the whole of his iguana, whereas poor Hannah Abbott lost her head completely at the next table and somehow managed to multiply her ferret into a flock of flamingos, causing the examination to be halted for 10 minutes while the birds were captured and carried out of the hall. They had their herbology exam on Wednesday. Other than a small bite from a fanged geranium, Harry felt he had done reasonably well. And then on Thursday, defense against the dark arts. Here, for the first time, Harry felt sure he had passed. He had no problem with any of the written questions, and took particular pleasure during the practical examination in performing all the counterjinxes and defensive spells right in front of Umbridge, who was watching coolly from near the doors into the entrance hall. "Oh, bravo!" cried Professor Tofty, who was examining Harry again, when Harry demonstrated a perfect Boggart banishing spell. "Very good indeed. Well, I think that's all, Potter. Unless..." He leaned forward a little. "I heard from my dear friend Tiberius Ogden that you can produce a Patronus for a bonus point." Harry raised his wand, looked directly at Umbridge, and imagined her being sacked. "Expecto Patronum!" The silver stag erupted from the end of his wand and cantered the length of the hall. All of the examiners looked around to watch his progress, and when it dissolved into silver mist, Professor Tofty clapped his veined and knotted hands enthusiastically. "Excellent!" he said. "Very well, Potter. You may go." As Harry passed Umbridge beside the door, their eyes met. There was a nasty smile playing around her wide, slack mouth, but he did not care. Unless he was very much mistaken, and he was not planning on saying it to anybody in case he was. He had just achieved an outstanding OWL. On Friday, Harry and Ron had the day off, while Hermione sat her Ancient Runes exam. And as they had the whole weekend in front of them, they permitted themselves a break from studying. They stretched and yawned beside the open window through which warm summer air wafted over them as they played a desultory game of wizard chess. Harry could see Hagrid in the distance, teaching a class on the edge of the forest. He was trying to guess what creature they were examining. He thought it must be unicorns because the boys seemed to be standing back a little, when the portrait hole opened and Hermione clambered in, looking thoroughly bad-tempered.
"Oh, how are the runes?"
said Ron, yawning and stretching. "I mistranslated AWAS," said Hermione furiously. "It means partnership, not defense. I mixed it up with AWAS."
Ah, well, said Ron lazily. It's only one mistake, isn't it? You'll still get...
Oh, shut up, said Hermione angrily. It could be one mistake that makes the difference between a pass and a fail. And what's more, someone's put another Niffler in Umbridge's office. I don't know how they got it through that new door, but I just walked past there, and Umbridge is shrieking her head off. By the sound of it tried to take a chunk out of her leg.
Good, said Harry and Ron together.
It is not good, said Hermione hotly. She thinks it's Hagrid doing it, remember? And we do not want Hagrid chucked out.
He's teaching at the moment. She can't blame him, said Harry, gesturing out of the window.
Oh, you're so naive sometimes, Harry. You really think Umbridge will wait for proof? Said Hermione, who seemed determined to be in a towering temper, and she swept off toward the girls' dormitories, banging the door behind her.
Oh, such a lovely, sweet-tempered girl, said Ron, very quietly, prodding his queen forward so that she could begin beating up one of Harry's knights. Hermione's bad mood persisted for most of the weekend, though Harry and Ron found it quite easy to ignore, as they spent most of Saturday and Sunday studying for potions on Monday, the exam to which Harry was looking forward the least, and which he was sure would be the one that would be the downfall of his ambitions to become an Auror. Sure enough, he found the written exam difficult, though he thought he might have got full marks on the question about Polyjuice Potion. He could describe its effects extremely accurately, having taken it illegally in his second year. The afternoon practical was not as dreadful as he had expected it to be. With Snape absent from the proceedings, he found that he was much more relaxed than he usually was while making potions. Neville, who was sitting very near Harry, also looked happier than Harry had ever seen him during a potions class. When Professor Marchbanks said, "Step away from your cauldrons, please. The examination is over," Harry corked his sample flask, feeling he might not have achieved a good grade, but he had, with luck, avoided a fail. "Only 4 exams left," said Parvati Patil wearily as they headed back to the Gryffindor common room. "Only?" said Hermione snappishly. "I've got arithmancy, and it's probably the toughest subject there is." Nobody was foolish enough to snap back, so she was unable to vent her spleen on any of them and was reduced to telling off some first years for giggling too loudly in the common room. Harry was determined to perform well in Tuesday's Care of Magical Creatures exam so as not to let Hagrid down. The practical examination took place in the afternoon on the lawn on the edge of the Forbidden Forest, where students were required to correctly identify the gnarl hidden among a dozen hedgehogs. The trick was to offer them all milk in turn. Gnarls, highly suspicious creatures whose quills had magical properties, generally went berserk at what they saw was an attempt to poison them. Then demonstrate correct handling of a bowtruckle, feed and clean a fire crab without sustaining serious burns, and choose from a wide selection of food the diet they would give a sick unicorn. Harry could see Hagrid watching anxiously out of his cabin window. When Harry's examiner, a plump little witch this time, smiled at him and told him he could leave, Harry gave Hagrid a fleeting thumbs up before heading back up to the castle. The astronomy theory exam on Wednesday morning went well enough. Harry was not convinced he had got the names of all Jupiter's moons right, but was at least confident that none of them was inhabited by mice. They had to wait until evening for their practical astronomy. The afternoon was devoted instead to divination. Even by Harry's low standards in divination, the exam went very badly. He might as well have tried to see moving pictures in the desktop as in the stubbornly blank crystal ball. He lost his head completely during tea leaf reading, saying it looked to him as though Professor Marchbanks would shortly be meeting a round, dark, soggy stranger, and rounded off the whole fiasco by mixing up the lifeline and headline on her palm and informing her that she ought to have died the previous Tuesday. "Well, we were always going to fail that one," said Ron gloomily as they ascended the marble staircase. He had just made Harry feel rather better by telling him how he told the examiner in detail about the ugly man with a wart on his nose and his crystal ball, only to look up and realize that he had been describing his examiner's reflection. "We shouldn't have taken this stupid subject in the first place," said Harry.
"Still, at least we can give it up now."
"Yeah," said Harry. "No more pretending we care what happens when Jupiter and Uranus get too friendly.
And from now on, I don't care if my tea leaves spell die, Ron, die. I'm just chucking them in the bin where they belong."
Harry laughed just as Hermione came running up behind them. He stopped laughing at once, in case it annoyed her.
"Well, I think I've done all right in arithmancy," she said, and Harry and Ron both sighed with relief. "Just time for a quick look over our star charts before dinner, then?"
When they reached the top of the astronomy tower at 11 o'clock, they found a perfect night for stargazing, cloudless and still. The grounds were bathed in silvery moonlight, and there was a slight chill in the air. Each of them set up his or her telescope and, when Professor Marchbanks gave the word, proceeded to fill in the blank star chart he or she had given them. Professor Marchbanks and Tofty strolled among them, watching as they entered the precise positions of the stars and planets they were observing.
All was quiet, except for the rustle of parchment, the occasional creak of a telescope as it was adjusted on its stand, and the scribbling of many quills. Half an hour passed, then an hour. The little squares of reflected gold light flickering on the ground below started to vanish as lights in the castle windows were extinguished. As Harry completed the constellation Orion on his chart, the front doors of the castle opened directly below the parapet where he was standing, so that light spilled down the stone steps a little way across the lawn. Harry glanced down as he made a slight adjustment to the position of his telescope and saw 5 or 6 elongated shadows moving over the brightly lit grass before the doors swung shut and the lawn became a sea of darkness once more. Harry put his eye back to his telescope and refocused it, now examining Venus. He looked down at his chart to enter the planet there, but something distracted him. Pausing with his quill suspended over the parchment, he squinted down into the shadowy grounds and saw 6 figures walking over the lawn. If they had not been moving, and the moonlight had not been gliding and gilding the top of their heads, they would have been indistinguishable from the dark ground on which they stood. Even at this distance, Harry had a funny feeling that he recognized the walk of the squattest among them, who seemed to be leading the group. He could not think why Umbridge would be taking a stroll outside past midnight, much less accompanied by 5 others. Then, somebody coughed behind him and he remembered that he was halfway through an exam. He had quite forgotten Venus's position. Jamming his eye to his telescope, he found it again, and was again on the point of entering it on his star chart when, alert for any odd sound, he heard a distant knock that echoed through the deserted grounds, followed immediately by the muffled barking of a large dog. He looked up, his heart hammering. There were lights on in Hagrid's window, and the people he had observed crossing the lawn were now silhouetted against them. The door opened, and he distinctly saw 6 tiny but sharply defined figures walk over the threshold. They closed the door again, and there was silence. Harry felt very uneasy. He glanced around to see whether Ron and Hermione had noticed what he had, but Professor Marchbanks came walking behind him at that moment, and not wanting to appear as though he was sneaking looks at anyone else's work, he hastily bent over his star chart and pretended to be adding notes to it while really peering over the top of the parapet toward Hagrid's cabin. Figures were now moving across the cabin windows, temporarily blocking the light. He could feel Professor Marchbanks' eyes on the back of his neck, and pressed his eye again to his telescope, staring up at the moon, though he had marked its position an hour ago. But as Professor Marchbanks moved on, he heard a roar from the distant cabin that echoed through the darkness right to the top of the astronomy tower. Several of the people around Harry ducked out from behind their telescopes and peered instead at the direction of Hagrid's cabin. Professor Tofty gave another dry little cough. "Try and concentrate now, boys and girls," he said softly. Most people returned to their telescopes. Harry looked to his left. Hermione was gazing transfixed at Hagrid's. 20 minutes to go," said Professor Tofty. Hermione jumped and returned at once to her star chart. Harry looked down at his own and noticed that he had mislabeled Venus as Mars. He went to correct it. There was a loud bang from the grounds. Several people said ouch as they poked themselves in the face with the ends of their telescopes, hastening to see what was going on below. Hagrid's door had burst open, and by the light flooding out of the cabin, they saw him quite clearly. A massive figure, roaring and brandishing his fists, surrounded by 6 people, all of whom, judging by the tiny threads of red light they were casting in his direction, seemed to be attempting to stun him. "No!" cried Hermione. "My dear," said Professor Tofty in a scandalized voice, "this is an examination." But nobody was paying the slightest attention to their star charts anymore. Jets of red light were still flying beside Hagrid's cabin, yet somehow they seemed to be bouncing off of him. He was still upright, and still, as far as Harry could see, fighting. Cries and yells echoed across the grounds. A man yelled, "Be reasonable, Hagrid!" And Hagrid roared, "Reasonably be damned! You won't take me like this, Dawlish!" Harry could see the tiny outline of Fang attempting to defend Hagrid, leaping at the wizards surrounding him, until a stunning spell caught him, and he fell to the ground. Hagrid gave a howl of fury, lifted the culprit bodily from the ground, and threw him. The man flew what looked like 10 feet and did not get up again. Hermione gasped, both hands over her mouth. Harry looked at Ron and saw that he too was looking scared. None of them had ever seen Hagrid in a real temper before. "Look!" squealed Parvati, who was leaning over the parapet and pointing to the foot of the castle where the front doors seemed to have opened again. More light had spilled out onto the dark lawn, and the single long black shadow was now rippling across the lawn. "Now really," said Professor Tofty anxiously. "Only 16 minutes left, you know." But nobody paid him the slightest attention. They were watching the person now sprinting toward the battle beside Hagrid's cabin. "How dare you!" the figure shouted as she ran. "How dare you!" "It's McGonagall," whispered Hermione. "Leave him alone! Alone, I say!" said Professor McGonagall's voice through the darkness. On what grounds are you attacking him? He has done nothing to warrant such... Hermione, Parvati, and Lavender all screamed. No fewer than 4 stunners had shot from the figures around the cabin toward Professor McGonagall. Halfway between the cabin and the castle, the red beams collided with her. For a moment she looked luminous, illuminated by an eerie red glow, then was lifted right off her feet, landed hard on her back, and moved no more. Galloping gargoyles! Shouted Professor Tofty, who seemed to have forgotten the exam completely. Not so much as a warning! Outrageous behavior! Cowards! Bellowed Hagrid, his voice carrying clearly to the top of the tower, and several lights flickered back on inside the castle. Ruddy cowards! Have some of that! And that! Oh my, gasped Hermione. Hagrid took 2 massive swipes at his closest attackers. Judging by their immediate collapse, they had been knocked cold. Harry saw him double over and thought for a moment that he had finally been overcome by his spell. But on the contrary, next moment Hagrid was standing again with what appeared to be a sack on his back. Then Harry realized that Fang's limp body was draped around his shoulders. Get him! Get him! Screamed Umbridge, but her remaining helper seemed highly reluctant to go within reach of Hagrid's fists. Indeed, he was backing away so fast he tripped over one of his unconscious colleagues and fell over. Hagrid had turned and begun to run with Fang still hung around his neck. Umbridge sent one last stunning spell after him, but it missed, and Hagrid, running full pelt toward the distant gates, disappeared into the darkness. There was a long minute's quivering silence, everybody gazing open-mouthed into the grounds. Then Professor Tofty's voice said feebly, 5 minutes to go, everybody. Though he had only filled in 2/3 of his chart, Harry was desperate for the end of the exam. When it came at last, he, Ron, and Hermione forced their telescopes haphazardly back into their holders and dashed back down the spiral staircase. None of the students were going to bed. They were all talking loudly and excitedly at the foot of the stairs about what they had witnessed. That evil woman, gasped Hermione, who seemed to be having difficulty talking due to rage. Trying to sneak up on Hagrid in the dead of the night? She clearly wanted to avoid another scene like Trelawney's, said Ernie Macmillan sagely, squeezing over to join them. Hagrid did well, didn't he? Said Ron, looking more alarmed than impressed. How come all the spells bounced off him? It'll be his giant blood, said Hermione shakily. It's very hard to stun a giant. They're like trolls, really tough. But poor Professor McGonagall, 4 stunners right to the chest? And she's not exactly young, is she? Dreadful, dreadful, said Ernie, shaking his head pompously. Well, I'm off to bed. Night all. People around them were drifting away, still talking excitedly about what they had just seen. At least they didn't get Hagrid off to Azkaban, said Ron. I expect he's going to join Dumbledore, hasn't he? I suppose so, said Hermione, who looked tearful. Oh, this is awful. I really thought Dumbledore would be back before long, but now we've lost Hagrid too. They traipsed back to the Gryffindor common room to find it full. The commotion out in the grounds had woken several people who had hastened to rouse their friends. Seamus and Dean, who had arrived ahead of Harry, Ron, and Hermione, were now telling everyone what they had heard from the top of the astronomy tower. But why sack Hagrid now? Asked Angelina Johnson, shaking her head. It's not like Trelawney. He's been teaching much better than usual this year. Umbridge hates part humans, said Hermione bitterly, flopping down into an armchair. She was always going to try and get rid of Hagrid. And she thought Hagrid was putting nifflers in her office, piped up Katie Bell. Oh, blimey, said Lee Jordan, covering his mouth. It's me's been putting the nifflers in her office. Fred and George left me a couple. I've been levitating them in through her window. She should have sacked him anyway, said Dean. He was too close to Dumbledore. That's true, said Harry, sinking into an armchair beside Hermione's. I just hope Professor McGonagall's all right, said Lavender tearfully. They carried her back up to the castle. We watched through the dormitory window, said Colin Creevey. She didn't look very well. Madame Pomfrey will sort her out, said Alicia Spinnet firmly. She's never failed yet. It was nearly 4 a.m. before the common room cleared. Harry felt wide awake. The image of Hagrid sprinting away into the dark was haunting him. He was so angry with Umbridge, he could not think of a punishment bad enough for her. Though Ron's suggestion of having her fed to a box of starving blast-ended Scroots had its merits. He fell asleep contemplating hideous revenges and arose from bed 3 hours later feeling distinctly unrested. Their final exam, History of Magic, was not to take place until that afternoon. Harry would very much have liked to go back to bed after breakfast, but he had been counting on the morning for a spot of last-minute studying. So, instead, he sat with his head in his hands by the common room window, trying hard not to doze off, as he read through some of the notes stacked 3.5 feet high that Hermione had lent him. The 5th years entered the great hall at 2 o'clock, and took their places in front of their overturned examination papers. Harry felt exhausted. He just wanted this to be over so that he could go and sleep. Then tomorrow, he and Ron were going down to the Quidditch pitch. He was going to have a fly on Ron's broom and savor their freedom from studying. "Turn over your papers," said Professor Marchbanks from the front of the hall, flicking over the giant hourglass. "You may begin." Harry stared fixedly at the first question. It was several seconds before it occurred to him that he had not taken in a word of it. There was a wasp buzzing distractedly against one of the high windows. Slowly, tortuously, he began to write an answer. He was finding it very difficult to remember names and kept confusing dates. He simply skipped question 4. In your opinion, did wand legislation contribute to or lead to better control of goblin riots of the 18th century? Thinking that he would go back to it if he had time at the end. He had a stab at question 5. How was the statute of secrecy breached in 1749, and what measures were introduced to prevent a recurrence? But had a nagging suspicion that he had missed several important points. He had a feeling vampires had come into the story somewhere. He looked ahead for a question he could definitely answer, and his eyes alighted upon number 10. Describe the circumstances that led to the formation of the International Confederation of Wizards and explain why the Warlocks of Liechtenstein refused to join. I know this, Harry thought, though his brain felt torpid and slack. He could visualize a heading in Hermione's handwriting. The formation of the International Confederation of Wizards. He had read these notes only this morning. He began to write, looking up now and again to check the large hourglass on the desk beside Professor Marchbanks. He was sitting right behind Parvati Patil, whose long dark hair fell below the back of her chair. Once or twice he found himself staring at the tiny golden lights that glistened in it when she moved her head very slightly, and had to give his own head a little shake to clear it. The first supreme mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards was Pierre Bonacord, but his appointment was contested by the wizarding community of Liechtenstein because... All around Harry, quills were scratching on the parchment like scurrying, burrowing rats. The sun was very hot on the back of his head. What was it that Bonacord had done to offend the wizards of Liechtenstein? Harry had a feeling it had something to do with trolls. He gazed blankly at the back of Parvati's head again. If he could only perform legilimency and open a window in the back of her head and see what it was about trolls that had caused the breach between Pierre Bonacord and Liechtenstein. Harry closed his eyes and buried his face in his hands so that the glowing red of his eyelids grew dark and cool. Bonacord had wanted to stop troll hunting and give the trolls rights, but Liechtenstein was having problems with the tribe of particularly vicious mountain trolls. That was it. He opened his eyes. They stung and watered at the sight of the blazing white parchment. Slowly he wrote 2 lines about the trolls, then read through what he had done so far. It did not seem very informative or detailed, yet he was sure Hermione's notes on the Confederation had gone on for pages and pages. He closed his eyes again, trying to see them, trying to remember. The Confederation met for the first time in France. Yes, he had written that already. Goblins had tried to attend but had been ousted. He had written that too. And nobody from Liechtenstein had wanted to come. Think, he told himself, his face in his hands, while all around him quills scratched out never-ending answers, and the sand trickled through the hourglass at the front. He was walking along the cool, dark corridor to the Department of Mysteries again, walking with a firm and purposeful tread, breaking occasionally into a run, determined to reach his destination at last. The black door swung open for him as usual, and here he was in the circular room with its many doors. Straight across the stone floor and through the second door, patches of dancing light on the walls, and floor that was that had the odd mechanical clicking, but no time to explore. He must hurry. He jogged the last few feet to the third door, which swung open just like the others. Once again, he was in the cathedral-sized room full of shelves and glass spheres. His heart was beating very fast now. He was going to get there this time. When he reached number 97, he turned left and hurried along the aisle between 2 rows. But there was a shape on the floor at the very end. A black shape, moving upon the floor like a wounded animal. Harry's stomach contracted with fear, with excitement. A voice issued from his own mouth. A high, cold, empty voice, empty of any human kindness. Take it from me. Lift it down now. I cannot touch it, but you can. The black shape upon the floor shifted a little. Harry saw a long-fingered white hand clutching a wand rise to the end of his own arm. He heard the high, cold voice say, Crucio! The man on the floor let out a scream of pain, attempted to stand, but fell back, writhing. Harry was laughing. He raised his wand, the curse lifted, and the figure groaned and became motionless. Lord Voldemort is waiting. Very slowly, His arms trembling, the man on the ground raised his shoulders a few inches and lifted his head. His face was blood-stained and gaunt, twisted in pain, yet rigid with defiance.
"You'll have to kill me," whispered Sirius.
"Undoubtedly I shall in the end," said the cold voice. "But you will fetch it from me first, Black. You think you have felt pain thus far? Think again. We have hours ahead of us, and nobody to hear you scream."
But somebody screamed as Voldemort lowered his wand again. Somebody yelled and fell sideways off a hot desk onto the cold stone floor. Harry hit the ground and awoke, still yelling, his scar on fire, as the great hall erupted all around him.